Hi guys, Chris Story here. Today I'll take you through 5 talent identification lessons all scouts must learn from the NBA draft, and I'll also take you through my top 5 2020 draft prospects. So lesson number 1, foreign players are drafted too low. So the key lesson to learn from this is it's vital to scout all draft talent thoroughly, even if they're not in your backyard. So whether they're interstate prospects, whether they're international, you really need to look at everyone who's of draft relevance. So some of the most egregious examples here, we've got Nikola Jokic, who picked 41. Well, that's absolutely disgusting. He led the Nuggets to the Western Conference Finals, which is a phenomenal achievement, and it speaks to how gifted he is. Giannis, two-time MVP now, and possibly the player many would argue you'd start a franchise with. And then you've also got Rudy Gobert, NBA Defensive Player of the Year. This is just way too low for him, and just having that length and wingspan, NBA scouts should have just known better. And this is just from a subset of years of 2011 to 2014, and we've got this many players who really should have gone higher than they did. So it just comes to show that NBA teams really need to look more closely at foreign talent, and even going back a couple of years, well, Luka Doncic picked 3. Well, that's incredible that he was picked in that spot, and pretty clearly in hindsight you'd take him number 1. So NBA clubs need to look a lot more closely at all the foreigners, because there's a lot of talent out there and there's a lot outside the United States. So lesson number 2, guys who have spent additional years in college are more valuable than NBA scouts believe. So what they're really missing here is the upside. So you look at Steph, Clay, Draymond, well, that led Golden State to 73 wins. They won a chip even before KD was there, 4 straight NBA finals, 2 chips. So seeing that from these 3 as the core for the first 2 of those runs at least, well, that's absolutely staggering. So Steph, he's changed the game. So now guys are pulling up from longer range and putting up more threes. So Steph's really been, that guy to really start that trend. So having a guy pick 9 several years in college and being able to do that's phenomenal. So, and then a Draymond, well, people didn't think he'd make it. They thought maybe role player at best, but it's been a phenomenal piece for Golden State, where he has played a role, but he's played a significant role, whether it's defending, passing, spacing the floor. Sometimes I know he's an inconsistent 3-point shooter and not much of a scorer, but great complementary piece. So you can get these guys who have had those years in college, and you don't necessarily need your one and dones to necessarily have that upside, where Steph, well, MVP right there. And Clay, well, again, one of the best 3-point shooters. So you can get talent from guys who have been in college for several years, and they do still have scope to develop. And Jimmy Butler's another story. Well, he was drafted as a senior, and people thought, role player at best. Wasn't in the Bulls' rotation initially, and eventually under Tibbs he sort of started slowly getting integrated, and he worked hard, and he's become an all-star as a result, and he's been able to help lead the Heat to the NBA Finals this year. So absolutely staggering stuff to achieve that. And he's someone where no matter which team he's on, well, he makes that team better, and whenever he leaves the team, well, they're much worse, as we saw with the Bulls, who haven't made the playoffs since. Minnesota's been a rabble since he left. Philadelphia, well, they don't look like anywhere near the same team since he's left, and now you've got the Heat, their NBA Finals. Well, you can get those sort of different makers from guys who have had those years in college. So don't sleep on the development potential if they have the work ethic and if they've got some of the attributes to potentially make it. And then you've even got a Dame Lillard. Well, in hindsight, you'd pick him, maybe some might argue pick 1, but I'd pick him pick 2 after AD. And look, another junior, had the upside, had the performances on the board, but just obviously phenomenal getting that sort of upside and that sort of growth sort of in the NBA during his years. So development can come later. It doesn't have to come as a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old. You can develop after those ages. So don't sleep on guys who have had those years in college, because there is still upside and scope to develop. So point number 3, availability I've always viewed as the best ability, but in saying that, you really can't pass on guys who have endured injuries as teenagers but have performed when they've been healthy, because they're the ones that are more likely to bounce back and have great pro careers. So whereas if you look at guys who are in their later 20s, in their 30s, well, they tend not to bounce back as well. So they're just things to be aware of. So Michael Porter Jr., so pick 14 in 2018, well, he was the third option on the Nuggets' run to the Western Conference Finals. So I think he'll be a terrific piece in the long run, and he's one to keep track of from an injury perspective, but look, in saying that, I think he'll be right. So, but one to keep track of anyway. So Zion, pick 1, Worthy, pick 1. Some might even be saying Ja Morant should have been pick 1. Look, he won Rookie of the Year, but for me, Zion is next level. He could be one of the all-time NBA greats, and I'm not going to sleep on him at all. I think he'll be terrific, but yeah, obviously you have to watch that he remains healthy, and part of that will be, some would argue, losing weight, but he also needs to, I guess, gain more flexibility. So that's something to look for him to do over the coming years, just to reduce that, I guess, proneness to injury. So hopefully he gets that right, because he's absolutely special when he's on the court. But Bol, he's probably the one where last year I had him clear top 5. I believe he was either 3 or 4 on my draft board. I think he might have been 4 in the end. And look, when he's actually gotten on the court late in the season, he was absolutely phenomenal. And he's someone where over the next few years, I think he'll become really one of the absolutely outstanding players. If I was to redo last year's draft, I'd actually pick Bol at 3, just seeing how he played last year. And really the only concern was injury. But in terms of actual talent, if you look at his numbers per 40 minutes from college, well, he was absolutely incredible when he was out there, whether it's his 3-point shooting, whether it's his shot blocking. He's an absolute phenomenal talent, just so fluid. You don't see that sort of fluidity at that height and that mobility, and all that 3-point range for that matter. So he's like an even taller Kevin Durant almost. So yeah, look, Bol will be absolutely fantastic, assuming he can remain healthy, and that'll be the question mark. But yeah, with his talent, well, you have to take the risk earlier than that. The fact that he wasn't even picked inside the first 20, well, that's just really ridiculous. And I think that there'll be a lot of recruiters that'll look back, or a lot of scouts that'll look back and think, we missed that one and we made a mistake there. So that's a really important lesson to learn, and you see that in other sports as well, where there've been guys who as 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds have got hurt, and then they've gone on and had incredible careers. So point number 4, so you need to take guys with performances on the board ahead of those you speculate may be good in the future. So you look at someone like a Luka Doncic, well, he was winning MVPs in Europe. So he won the EuroLeague MVP in 2018, so it's pretty embarrassing that he made it to pick 3 when you had the likes of Ayton and Bagley picked ahead of him. That's just ridiculous. And then you've got someone like Trae Young. Well, he put up almost 30 and 10 over the year, just dropped a little bit short of that, but putting up those numbers in points, assists, shooting as many threes as he was and making as many threes as he was, well, his game was always going to translate. And what recruiters were thinking, or what scouts were thinking, just that blows my mind that he could make it to pick 5. So got guys like Steph, he was putting up buckets, people didn't realize what he was doing. Danny Granger, he was putting up buckets, shouldn't have dropped to pick 17. Hassan Whiteside, well, he was putting up phenomenal numbers across the board. Blocks per game, just ridiculous. Good rebounds, good scoring. So dropping a pick 33, he was putting up top 10 numbers. So you really need to look closely at how they're performing, what they're actually achieving on the court practically. It's not all about numbers, but it's about performance specifically. So you want guys who have those performances on the board, and if you're thinking of guys where they've got a few attributes where maybe they develop, well, you pick them after those guys who have actually performed, and performed consistently ideally. So that's something that you really need to be aware of. And then point 5, before I get into who my top 5 picks in this year's NBA draft are. So if we look at the guys who have grown later, so that's something you really need to watch out for, because those guys have additional upside. So you look at someone like AD, well, he grew from a point guard into a power forward center. Well, he's kept those guard skills and that same mobility, but now he's got the height, and it's just, he's an incredible player. He's one of the very best in the NBA, and if you wanted a complementary star, well, he'd be the first you'd pick for that role. So, just seeing that sort of growth, you really need to watch for that. And same with someone like Giannis. Well, he was still growing in the last few years, and because he still had that later growth plus that work ethic on top of that, well, he's gone from a skinny tall guy to a really bulky but still very athletic guy. So, but yeah, again, he was still growing though that little bit in sort of those years. Even once he was drafted into the NBA, he still grew a little bit for that first year or two in terms of like actually vertically as opposed to just physically. So you really need to watch for that. And same story with Paul George, where he was picked later than he should have been, and the reason for that is that he was still growing. So given that he was still growing, well, he still had a lot of scope to develop and really grow into his body, which he really has, and he's become a really multi-time all-star and one of the really good players by position. So, and then you've got someone like Zion. Well, again, he was a point guard as a kid, and then he grew into a physical beast. And look, he's not all that tall necessarily for a forward as he is in the NBA, but look, in saying that, well, he's put on an incredible amount of muscle over recent years, and he's become a phenomenal athlete. And given he's a late bloomer, well, if he can stay healthy, I actually suspect that he's got a phenomenal amount of development left in him. So, that's a pretty scary prospect with Zion, given how great he already is. But if he's healthy, well, he could be one of the real all-time players in NBA history, or he could go down as that. So that's a narrative to watch. And someone like Russell Westbrook, well, he kept growing, and by growing that little bit later, and again having that willpower and that will to win, that real desire, that work ethic, well, he was always going to be great. So again, late bloomer, and he became a phenomenal player as a result. And then you've got a CJ McCollum, where if you look at some of his things from when he was in school, well, he was really tiny. So, and then he grew to 6'3", or whatever he is now, maybe 6'4" at best. So, but yeah, look, growing sort of as much as he did over those years, well, he's been able to really develop into a really good NBA player. So, and really a worthy number 2 option from someone where you'd think, oh, he shouldn't be making a school team. So, so you really look for those late bloomers, and if you really track their development, well, you really want to look at, I guess, their rate of improvement. So you're looking for them, so if they're growing in terms of height, well, they've still probably got some, I guess, basketball development to go, but you're also looking for those guys who are really boosting those numbers year on year and at the quickest possible rates, because that's the other sort of indicator there in terms of development. So before I get into my 2020 top 5, just for a bit of history, because I have followed the NBA draft for a number of years, and unfortunately before 2018 I wasn't recording my top 5s, but the last 2 years I have on Twitter, so there's a public record as evidence, I suppose, for those seeking that. But 2018 I had Trae Young as my number 1 pick, Mo Bamba at 2, who I believe will still come good, but he's just never got the minutes. So if he can move to another team and get greater opportunities, I think he'll become a piece. But unfortunately that hasn't happened to date. I had Jaren Jackson at 3, Luka Doncic at 4, so I'm pretty embarrassed by having Doncic at 4, because initially in that year I had him at 2 and I shouldn't have moved him down, but just in thinking about perimeter players and thinking, oh, he's not quick enough to play on the perimeter on the NBA, he won't be able to defend anyone, well, that's a mistake on my part, and one I've really learnt from the performance perspective, and not to sleep on those guys who really have that, I guess, international performance. So, and we all learn from drafts, so that's really important that we all take lessons out of everything every year. And then I also had Colin Sexton in there at 5. So, yeah. So I'm happy with Trae Young at 1. Really, in hindsight, you'd have him at 2, and Doncic you'd have clear number 1. But we all make mistakes. But look, I was happy to avoid Ayton. I was happy to avoid Bagley. So if there are any positives out of that, well, I'll take that. And Carter, well, he's a role player, so for a second rounder, that's a decent return. So I'm happy enough with that call. And Jackson as well, well, he's a good piece, so look, I can't get too upset by that. He might be probably, in hindsight, my third guy, but it's really just moving Luka to 1, Trey to 2, and then Mo Bamba down from there. But yeah, then on to last year's draft. Well, Zion number 1. Well, that was to me an obvious call, and he could be the best in the NBA in the future, assuming good health, and that's the assumption. But I would still pick him over Ja Morant. Morant will be a multi-time All-Star. Is a number 1 piece, so he'll have a phenomenal career. But yeah, I can't go past Zion. Garland at 3. I think he'll develop. He's got a 3-point shot that I think will really come along over the next few years, so keep tracking his development. And I went with the surprise of Bol Bol at 4, so this could, in hindsight, turn out to be a legendary call. If I'm to redo last year's draft and redo my own order, I'm personally going Bol Bol at 3. So Zion and Morant 1 and 2. Bol Bol could even pass Morant, but it's just based on injuries. Look, I would go the less risky option in Morant, but Bol Bol, look, is a transcendent sort of piece where he does things no one else in the NBA can do. And when you've got guys who can do something no one else can do in a sport, well, then they're a really special prospect and you really want that guy on your team. So as a Bulls fan, I'd love to see Bol Bol traded to the Bulls. Any way that he could come over, I'd absolutely love. But yeah. And then you've got RJ Barrett, who I thought would be about the 5th best, and I think that'll probably prove about right. So, but yeah, my comment here was Bol Bol grossly underrated and has best in the draft scope. So both he and Zion, they're the two where they could be the best in the draft, could almost be the best in the NBA sort of thing. So that's how special I think those two guys are in terms of their absolute upside if it's realized. And then Garland, I think he'll be a good piece too, but that's a wait and see. He was only okay last year, so we'll see how good he becomes. But now, finally, the much-awaited top 5. So my opinion of the 2020 draft is that there's no, I guess, all-time sort of players in this group. I don't think there'll be any MVPs amongst this group. James Wiseman, I think, will be the best player. Just looking at his numbers per 40 minutes, even though he barely played in college, well, just seeing how good he is, how athletic he is, he's really got that upside where he could be the best rebounder in the NBA if anyone's watched his rebounding, shot blocking good, he can even score. He does need to become a better perimeter defender, needs to improve his lateral quickness. There's quite a few fundamentals that he still needs to develop, but he's someone where he could become one of the best bigs, if not the best big in the NBA. And you can't really have a big as a number 1 option anymore in the NBA, but that's more a reflection on the quality of, or lack of quality of this draft, I suppose, compared to what we see in most years, where I just don't think there's that sort of guy. And if we're to look at like all NBA teams, Wiseman is probably that one guy where I think, yeah, he has that real upside to be that NBA first team guy. Whereas if I was to say there was another guy with all NBA talent, and this is why he's at number 2 on my list, is probably Anthony Edwards. But even he has some polishing up to do where, look, his 3-point shooting does need to get better defensively. He just needs to apply himself a lot more, but he's someone where, look, he can get to the rim, he can make buckets. I'd like to see him probably move the ball more and be able to play a bit more off the ball, but yeah, look, he's someone where he's a poor man's James Harden, where, look, I don't think he'll put up that same volume, he won't be that same passer, but he can be a good piece. So he can definitely be an all-star. If he's an all-NBA player, it's probably more like all-NBA third team. I don't think he'll be a first or second team guy, so that's something to watch. Denny, I think he'll be a really high probability starter. I don't think he'll be an all-star, but he'll be a really good starter for a team. And he's someone where he just moves the ball. He can shoot, and I think his shooting will keep getting better. But he's someone where just in terms of his all-round game, he's that real, I guess, easy fit for any team, any system. Just a really good complement and a really, I'd say, high-level starter is what I'm thinking, where he has that sort of all-round game to be that. And then I've got a really underrated guy, so Aaron Nesmith. So he's someone where he probably lands somewhere around pick 10, but he's someone I'm really bullish on, where
he could be something like probably a poor man's Klay Thompson, where he doesn't need any possessions. He's just a catch and shoot 3-and-D guy, where defensively sensational, 3-point shooting sensational. So people, in my opinion, are really sleeping on him, and I think he'll be that real surprise in this draft. So he's one to watch. And Killian Hayes, I was a bit split on pick 5, but Hayes, I think he's got upside to him, where he's got most things. Look, if he could dribble to the right a bit more, he'd be good, but he's one of those guys where he's got that fluidity, the height, length, and I think he'll become a better shooter as he goes. So if he develops that 3-point shot and he develops a right hand, well, he could have that all-star upside. But with Hayes compared to, say, a Denny, I think there is also more downside risk. So that's something to be aware of. Obi, I was sort of thinking about as maybe is number 5 on this board, but just defensively, where I just wasn't sort of impressed enough, where just in terms of lateral quickness, he just doesn't have that at all. So he's someone where he can dribble, pass and shoot, so I think he's got a spot in the NBA, and I think he could be a starter, honestly. So if you've got a pretty open court, I think he'd be a good fit for probably Atlanta, where in combination with Trae Young, I sort of see that as a good fit. But yeah, just his defensive, I guess, limitations will be what, I guess, prevents him from being that, I guess, top sort of player in this draft. So, and many will be asking about, well, what about LaMelo Ball? Well, for me, I don't see him as a top 5 pick. I think he'll make it. He'll have an NBA career. He can probably be a starter, but a bit like his brother is a bit too limited, where although he's a bit more shot happy, well, he's just a very low percentage 3-point shooter. And look, mid-range, he doesn't have that sort of mid-range game at all. I think he's a poor mid-range shooter with his release point, and he can get to the rim a little, but he's not an explosive finisher at the rim. What he does, well, he's a great passer. He's someone who really gets the ball moving and gets the ball moving quickly. So he's someone where in the right system, he can have a career, a bit like with his brother. So, but yeah, defensively, maybe a little bit behind Lonzo, but offensively, probably a bit more of a shot-happy version. But I think his ceiling is probably pretty similar. And for me, that's probably, he's a top 15 pick, probably top 10 in terms of quality and what he'll become. And last but not least, of course, every draft has some sleepers. So the two I've got firstly Pokasevsky. So he's someone where he's a 7-foot center, but he's got the dribble, pass and shoot. So 3-point range, he's basically a 7-foot shooting guard. So he's someone where special talent offensively, but defensively currently is a liability, to keep it real, where defensively he's poor, he's not a good rebounder, so you really need to have those defenders and rebounders around him to make it work. But yeah, look, he's someone where, given he's got the dribble, pass and shoot, great 3-point shooter. So yeah, look, he's someone where he could develop. He's a high risk, high reward type, but yeah, he's an intriguing talent who I concede if I had a 2nd round pick, I'd probably get sucked into if I wanted a floor spacing big. But yeah, I think he could come good, you never know. And then you've got, if I wanted a more certain 2nd round pick, well, I like Marcus Howard. So he's someone where he's a high volume 3-point shooter, he gets to the line, he's just a great scorer. So he's someone where he's instant buckets off the bench if you want that on the perimeter. And look, he's under 6 foot, he's pretty lightly built. Defensively, he'll struggle in the NBA, to be real, but we've had so many of those under 6 foot guards who, although undersized, they've actually had really good NBA careers, whether it's your Aaron Brooks, Nate Robinson. You can get all those sort of guys who off the bench can just be that sort of spark plug type, and that's exactly the role Howard can play. And he's a really high probability of an NBA career if he can be part of an NBA rotation, because he can do that sort of thing for you. And high percentage free throw shooter as well, so there's situations where you would put him on the court for obviously offensive reasons. So I also like to finish off by looking at, well, given my interest predominantly is in the AFL recruiting space, well, I guess how can these lessons be applied to AFL scouts? So foreign players, you'd think, oh, it's overseas, it's a different thing, it doesn't really apply to AFL. Well, the context I'd be looking at this category is more so looking at interstate prospects. So you could be looking at guys in the Sandful or Waffle playing league football. Well, it's a bit like if you're playing in EuroLeague. Well, in the EuroLeague, you're playing against men. So it's the same if you're a Victorian recruiter for a Victorian club. You really want to look at those league performances and those guys who really against grown men who have that sort of, I guess, experience. Well, it's really valuable, and you see that with so many. And in this draft, well, the key examples would be you've got Logan McDonald, who made the Waffle Team of the Year, which is really unheard of, and most of the year he was leading the goal kicking. So he could be that, I guess, if you like, you're a Luka Doncic of this draft. So, and then you've even got, well, you've got Riley Tilthorpe, who, look, he's someone where he's been in the best in 5 of 9 games in the Sandford at league level, and here's another of those pick one potential candidates where if Adelaide go with the, I guess, home player or that local talent, well, he could be another that sort of fits that category where, again, it's not foreign, but it's someone where you'd be looking at really those interstate talents as those equivalents. And it's the same if you're looking in Tasmania, if you're looking in the NEFL at any of the Queensland, New South Wales, even Northern Territory guys. There's guys who are very draftable in those leagues. And the NEFL, well, you're playing against men, and it's the same if you're in the TSL. So basically the key lesson is you really want to be following all those foreign leagues, or in the AFL context, the interstate leagues, and really be all over that talent and know that talent just as well as you do the local Victorian talent. And with this number 2, well, although we don't really have, I guess, college football, if you like, in Australia, well, what we do have is we have state leagues. And this is where this concept can really be applied, where we have guys running around in the state leagues who are performing really well, and a lot of them are performing to AFL standards. So clubs really need to pay more attention to the state leagues, be it VFL, Sandful, Waffle, NEFL, even TSL to a lesser extent. Well, you really need to follow all these leagues and really be all over that talent. And again, what scouts are doing in the AFL, and it's the exact same mistakes the NBA scouts are making, where they're overlooking guys who are those years older, where you've got these guys who had 3-4 years in college. Well, you need to look at the state leagues in the same way, where you can have guys who have had 3-4, can be more years in the state leagues, and it doesn't matter. Where you can have a Tim Kelly, where he's one of the better midfielders in the AFL. So you really can't overlook those guys who have that state league experience, where if they can play, they can play. So you need to draft them, and they still do have scope to develop. Just like in these NBA examples, where we've got all these guys who have had phenomenal NBA careers to date. Well, the exact same story in the AFL. And you've got the likes of Geelong, where they got Tim Kelly, they got Tom Stewart. Well, you need to really pay respect to those guys in the state league, because there's guys running around in those competitions who should be in the AFL now. So, and the fourth lesson, well, in the AFL, the context of taking guys with performances on the board, well, you don't need to look too far beyond just the 2012 draft, where you had Brady Grundy at pick 18. Well, that's really the first time a ruckman who had been that good had been taken so late. And really, throughout most of the year, people were talking about him as a consensus top 3 pick. So, and then going pick 18, well, that's ridiculous for someone who was the best ruckman since Nick Nutt, and we haven't seen a better ruckman since come through the junior ranks. And then in the same draft, well, you had a John O'Rourke at pick 2 and Lockie Plowman pick 3. Well, there was good reason I didn't rate either of them inside my top 10 that year, because they didn't have the performances on the board. And that's something I'm sure recruiters have learnt from since, where you really want to take guys where you could look at an O'Rourke and think, okay, he has acceleration, skills are good, but unless you're winning enough of your own ball, and you don't have those performances on the board with the consistency that they need to, well, why are you taking him pick 2? Or a Lockie Plowman at pick 3, who's an undersized sort of key defender who doesn't really have numbers or performances on the board that's comparable to guys like a Jack McRae or an Ollie Wines. So that's a really important sort of consideration.
So guys, in the comment section below, let me know whether there's any other lessons that I could have added to that list, because I'm always learning too, just as hopefully every other recruiter is, if they want to keep getting better and keep ensuring that their clubs get better recruits. And yeah, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for future updates. And also let me know, would you like me to produce more NBA related content in the future? And would you like something along the lines of some key trade lessons perhaps that can be learnt from the NBA and applied to the AFL? Thanks guys, see you in the next video.